and those people trying to rebuild their lives after being part of a cult. And the challenge really was listening to their stories and trying to figure out what was truly their story and what was something that had been sort of indoctrinated into them as part of the cult, that this narrative that they'd taken on. And then part of the story work is like not to say, get rid of this, do that, is to go, well, these are the two narratives you've got running. Which, do you want to keep them? Are they serving you? Like, it's up to you. You get to live your life. You get to create the story of your life, the journey of your life. So do you want to keep that? You might have got it from the cult, but it might be actually the reason why people got attracted to the cult, because this narrative is useful and beneficial. Or it might be this is a narrative that's used to control you and stop you from doing the things that you want to do. And you might want to get rid of it,
And I think the stories people tell themselves, especially as leaders these days, often can be keeping them from forming the connections, because they have a certain idea of who they need to be as a leader, like what's the right behavior for a leader. And so if you're working with people on their stories and like coaching them on how they show up or how they interact with their teams, then if they view themselves, or like their stories are all about leaders that have to be distant and not connecting with people and bosses more than leaders, then they're gonna show up to work a different way. And if they see how they can use storytelling to connect with people, and like you do with sounds like the coaching, where you're helping people open up and build stronger connections, which a lot of people are looking for from their leaders, then it can be a matter of using the same storytelling tools to connect more with the teams and employees that these leaders are working with. Your business's success depends on relationships with customers, relationships with employees, and relationships with stakeholders. What do they all have in common? They're all human. Because no matter if your business is B2B or B2C, it's really H to H, human to human. Welcome to the Human Connection Podcast. I'm your host, Karl Pontau. Each week, I'll bring you stories, insights, and practical advice from experts that you can apply to your growing company and daily life. This week, I'm excited to connect with Mark Tweddle. Mark has been learning about human connection since he was born in Singapore and throughout growing up in Scotland, putting down roots in London and transforming in Los Angeles. In Scotland, he gained an honors degree in electronic engineering, but found that connection of technology to be limiting. Where the technocrat saw users, he saw real people. In London, he gained an MBA and extensive experience in government and delivering services. However, he found the connection of government to be frustrating and misunderstood. So when his wife was offered a great job in LA, he jumped at the opportunity to be the primary parent to their two young boys and experienced the wealth of human connection which that role brings. As their boys grew, Lynn and Mark built a life focused on connection through narrative. After Lynn told some of her stories at some of their larger curated events, a producer with The Moth suggested Lynn teach storytelling to people wanting to get their story heard. This nudge led to Mark and Lynn creating youtellyours.com and its associated coaching, classes, group dynamics work, a weekly blog, books, and a podcast or 3. Congrats on You Tell Yours, and welcome to the Human Connection Podcast.
Oh, thank you, Karl. It's good to see you.
Yeah, great to connect. And I love storytelling as well. Big fan of it. It's been a huge part of my life. And so I'd love to discuss how storytelling creates strong connections, not just connections, quote unquote.
Yeah, at one point I got so disappointed and confused with social media, because a LinkedIn connection or a Facebook friend, they aren't really a strong connection at all. At one point I did a podcast called Connection Requested, where I did a podcast episode with anyone who requested to connect with me, because I just wanted to know why, like who was the real person behind that request and what was going on there. And a lot of the time there was just nothing. Everybody who sent me a connection request got an invite to the podcast, and the ones who were real people and were not afraid said yes, they would do it, and we would tell a few stories and stuff. And Others were maybe bots, or they were just wanting to get to above that 500 number or whatever it was. But what I know from storytelling is that that's the huge gift that humans have. Storytelling is how we grow as a human race. So storytelling, if you think even before we could speak, we were doing cave drawings, and on those cave drawings, they would say, look, this is where you can get the fish. This is where you should stay away from the snakes. This is where you can hunt this. That's what those cave paintings were. They were different human beings sharing their experience. So, and that really became apparent once my wife started teaching storytelling, because when she started teaching storytelling, there's this thing of, well, you know what? Everyone tells stories. They just do. Mothers tell stories to their children. It's just a thing that we do. And yet somehow we've allowed ourselves to have storytelling owned by marketers and entertainment people. And we keep telling the same story again. Usually it's the hero's journey, that structure of story, just different nouns, different nouns, different nouns. You better have some great nouns, because we've told every version of that story. But actually, when you talk about humans and how they connect, if you tell a story, and here's my top tip: ignore opinions. No one cares about your opinions. Your opinions can go on social media. That creates division. That's what opinions do. I don't know if you like this as a phrase, but opinions are like assholes. Everyone's got one, but you just don't need to show it. It is just that. So a story is you relating what your experience and your perspective was. So, don't tell me, who you blame for the car crash. Tell me what your experience was. This is what you saw. This is what happened then. This is what you felt. This is why you did this. This is your total experience. And then I'll decide myself who I think is to blame. And if I hear 5 different versions of experience, I'll come up with my own opinion. And I'll actually listen to them all much more detailed, in a much more detailed way than I would if I started my listening with, that's a Republican or a Democrat's opinion. Once you get into opinion, you get into politics. Once you get into opinion, you get into prejudice. You can listen to anybody's story if they just tell you like what they experienced and what they their perception of that event, and you will learn something from them more when they're least like you. Right? So you can learn all these wonderful things from somebody else.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think that it's when you talk about how human beings, what makes us different from other animals, that we tell stories and our brains are wired for storytelling, and it's something that makes us human. And when if you're not trying to tell stories as best as you can, like I said, by removing the opinion and sharing your experiences, then it leads to more division. Where if you share stories that, especially ones that are about universal human experiences and emotions, that draws people together because it gets past a lot of the surface level divisiveness and connects us at what really who we are as people and as human beings. And it's something that I love what you're doing with this whole, like, this name, You Tell Yours, like, just tell your story. And when people actually get past opinion, get past the prejudice and just share stories, you realize all the things that we have in common and that the things that connect us, and get less hung up on the surface level, superficial, divisive stuff.
Yeah. We're very, very often people will just take on some other story they've heard. That's often what we find. At one point, my wife was coaching some people who'd gone through being members of a cult, like a really a horrible. It was like a massive court case and all that kind of stuff, and those people trying to rebuild their lives after being part of a cult, and the challenge really was listening to their stories and trying to figure out what was truly their story and and what was something that had been sort of indoctrinated into them as part of the cult, that this narrative that they'd taken on. And then part of the story work is like not to say, get rid of this, do that, is to go, well, these are the two narratives you've got running. Which do you want to keep them? Are they serving you? Like, it's up to you. You get to live your life. You get to create the story of your life, the journey of your life. So do you want to keep that? You might have got it from the cult, but it might be actually the reason why people got attracted to the cult, because this narrative is useful and beneficial. Or it might be this was the one that this is a narrative that's used to control you and stop you from doing the things that you want to do. And you might want to get rid of it, you know.
And I think the stories people tell themselves, especially as leaders these days, often can be keeping them from forming the connections, because they have a certain idea of who they need to be as a leader, like what's the right behavior for a leader. And so if you're working with people on their stories and like coaching them on how they show up or how they interact with their teams, then if they view themselves, or like if their stories are all about leaders that have to be distant and not connecting with people and kind of, and like, you know, bosses more than leaders, then they're going to they're going to show up to work a different way. And if they see how they can use storytelling to connect with people, and like you do with sounds like the coaching, where you're helping people open up and build stronger connections, which a lot of people are looking for from their leaders, then it can be a matter of using the same storytelling tools to connect more with the teams and employees that these leaders are working with. And by using stories that way, they can change the direction of how their company's going, whether it comes to employee turnover or like marketing and that sort of stuff, because they're connecting on a deeper level than just what people get from connecting, quote unquote, on like LinkedIn or Facebook, for example.
Yeah, I think I'd like to draw a distinction as well between a story where you're trying to persuade someone, or you're trying to, you know, pitch for a sale or investment or something like that, where you're broadcasting, you're presenting, compared to a storytelling that's to connect. So what we've done with groups and teams is sort of they're basically storytelling events where we give exercises. So if I gave you a 2-minute timer we put up here, and we said, all right, well, Karl, tell me the story of your name, right? So it's not that invasive. You know, your name's written on the bottom box of this video. And then you would choose what you told about that. You might have liked it, not liked it. You might have been teased about it beginning with a K instead of a C. You'll tell us what has been important in your life experience of having that name, and it's your story. It's as deep and philosophical as you like, or as shallow and data driven as you like. But at the end of that 2 minutes, we'll know more about you, who you are as a person, how you see the world, in very kind of broad terms, and we'll connect with that. And then if you do that same exercise, but you give everybody in the room 2 minutes, and you go around one after the other, you'll realize how different and yet similar we all are. Because it's not polished. You didn't know, you weren't prepared for that. You've not brought a script, and it's your story. So it's not like it's up to you what you say. You know, you can tell us as much or as little as you want about your name. And so that's what we did, was like storytelling exercises that were as basic as that. We're not to be confused with the kind of openers where, you know, when often people would sort of dismiss the work that I've done as saying, oh, you know, those were great openers. Like some people do these exercises to open up discussion or whatever, and that's keying into a part of it. But the other parts are creating a safe room, making sure that everybody has the same amount of time, making sure that people fill their time, because not everybody is comfortable speaking. Mm-hmm. But you know what? Everybody can tell a story. And at the beginning, when we started this, lots of people told us not everybody can tell a story, but they can. And especially if it's just 2 minutes, and especially if they are the world expert, like you're the world, there's nobody else knows what it was like to to grow up as you with that name, right?
Yeah,
it's
no research required on that. It's just about my experience. And
yeah.
I love that because it also, especially if you're in like a business setting, it's you're not trying to sell to anyone and it's not trying to persuade. It's just sharing stories that connects people, because I'm sure in these exercises, when people are sharing something like that about their name, they're going to bring up, like for me, it's a connection. I'm named after my uncle. And so there's a family connection there. So I'm sure someone else will be like, oh, I was named after a family member too. Now there's this shared experience, this shared connection that, again, it's just about showing people how much they have in common that isn't visibly apparent to them. And that in the context of helping people feel heard and understood by their colleagues and by the people they spend a lot of time with, goes a long way to improving workplace cultures and relationships, and actually building that capital C connection, and not just the social media style connection that is so fragile.
Yeah. And it also, people don't necessarily come to us because everything's going particularly well in their in their team or whatever, right? So there's something that they can't put the finger on that's not, the team isn't gelling for some reason. They try to figure out what's going on. One of their early team buildings, I remember one of the people in this team couldn't tell the truth. Could not tell a true story about themselves. Could not speak for 2 minutes on the story of their name without going into fiction and outlandish fantasy. They were trying their best to hide. Like, they did not want to turn up. And the look of relief around that group and the aha moment around that group was massive. It was palpable, because that person, they suddenly realized, oh, and what that person was doing was, essentially, whenever they had a discussion with any other team member, they were always talking about somebody else and what somebody else thinks about them, and they were playing people off each other, and it was making a really destructive thing go on in that workplace. And we don't ask hugely invasive, and we have to be careful about, we did a lot of sort of experimentation and testing with public groups doing storytelling before we took it to teams and into a kind of business scenario, because sometimes, I remember meeting somebody and they said they'd done this exercise during the pandemic that they thought would be really sweet and funny and all the rest of it, because everybody's on Zoom. And they said, all right, show us the contents of your fridge. And that was hugely invasive. Hugely personal. It's not quite showing your underwear drawer, but it's like, and they just hadn't thought that, oh, I really don't need to see the inside of everyone's refrigerator. That's not what we want. So we have to, we did a bunch of tests, and sometimes they surprised us that things were more invasive and people were uncomfortable with, and then others were fine. You can do story of your first car, and even if you didn't have a first car, you can still talk about your relationship with cars. It's not.
That's very interesting how you're able to, one, identify problems in communication with team members. That case story was fascinating, with the guy that just couldn't tell a honest story about themselves for 2 minutes, and how that much revealed about what was causing some of the workplace turmoil. And it doesn't have to be, I think one of the biggest fears people have is being vulnerable, and that storytelling doesn't have to be deeply personal to build connections. You can start with baby steps, and like I said, talking about a name or talking about like stuff that is kind of small talk, but it's stuff that we've kind of forgotten how to do that with people in a natural setting or natural way. I think you mentioned this on your website, how just like the kind of chit chat is just kind of like that. People don't really have that same sort of kind of casual conversation anymore. And by bringing that back to teams and making it not just all business or not, and it really helps people feel connected at work, and just makes the environment much more cohesive and fostering building good relationships rather than just like a place you go to work all the time.
Yeah, and so especially if you're in some sort of team that's got to be innovative or creative, you know, they've got to be able to make mistakes. You don't build anything without making mistakes. How do you make mistakes if you don't really know the people around you and whether they're going to use those mistakes against you in the future, or you don't have trust, and you build up that connection. That connection is trust and allows you to then go, this might be a silly idea, but what if we did that? And then you can have a discussion. You know, you're not going to be sort of put down for that.
Yeah.
The thing that really interests me at the moment is we're considering sort of starting up the public group that we did before. When we started the public group, it was called Fish and Bear, and it was called Fish and Bear. It was a bit of a bane of a name for us, because with a Scottish accent, Americans hear fish and beer and think we're going to have a barbecue or something.
Yeah.
But it's not. It's stories can be broken down into, there's fish in the lake. That's a good thing. You can go and get sustenance there. There's a bear in the cave. You might want to be careful next to the caves. You maybe don't want to go into those caves unless you're hunting bears, I guess, and taking that risk. But and so what we were testing with the experiments was, you know, trying to figure out what were good story exercises, but also were we right that everybody could tell a story? Like literally anybody off the street could tell a story, and they could. That we proved. Now what I want to do is start up that group and sort of spread it wherever it spreads, basically as a group just to connect people, and not necessarily, we used to make sure anybody who came to the group had to take part. They had to, you know, do the storytelling exercises. But that's, if the objective is connection, not everybody has to tell a story. If you're not comfortable and you just want to connect by listening, through active listening to the people and talk to them afterwards, that's totally fine. And so we're thinking, you know, so, you know, I've removed all the social media apps off of my phone. I don't want that kind of engagement economy type thing going on. I haven't found it very useful for me, and I want stronger connections. And I think part of the reason that we have a world that's so fragmented is because we're struggling with connection. We've got a lot of division. And so I think starting up public groups and maybe becoming sort of communities and networks of communities of people who are connecting through sort of storytelling events would be really useful in the world. I'm not really thinking of it as a business venture as such. I'm more thinking of it as a good thing to do.
Yeah, I love that idea. Well, on that note, thank you so much for connecting with me today, Mark. If you enjoyed this episode of the Human Connection podcast, please leave a review, and share it. If you'd like to connect with myself or Mark, check out the links in the show notes. And remember, no matter if your business is B2B or B2C, it's really H to H, human to human. Happy connecting.